fantastic. Thank you so much, Lord Norton. That was fascinating. And if everybody else wants to talk about restoration and renewal as well, you have unlimited time to do so. I will pass over now to Dalila Maulide, Inter-parliamentary cooperation in times of pandemics. Take it away. She's going to be sharing some slides with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for having accepted my paper proposal. I'm very excited to be at the PSA event. It's my first one. So, and I'm very lucky to follow such brilliant presentations, which surprisingly or not, raised a lot of the questions that are current in interparliamentary cooperation. So I wanted to bring a different perspective to this debate. I know that this audience is mainly comprised of people in the legislative field, but I believe this will be also interesting for you. So as COVID-19 demanded the reorganization of parliaments at the national level, interparliamentary organizations that are made of parliaments, national parliaments, also felt the same. Well, didn't felt the same. They were obliged to reorganize their ways of working. And the thing is that interparliamentary organizations are comprised of different national parliaments with different cultures, different ways of working, and even among inter-parliamentary organizations, each organization has its own way of working. The main problem with the functioning in these months was that most of the work of inter-parliamentary organizations is based on travel and on displacement. Up until now, we didn't know it was possible to establish inter-parliamentary links without traveling, without visiting, without meeting in person, and so this has been an interesting experience, since most of the activity relates to physical presence in meetings, electoral observation missions, visits, international visits. This has been a real challenge. At the same time, since it would be impossible to bring a full, to shed light on how all of the international organizations are dealing with the challenges, I decided to bring you the perspective on three organizations that are the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and the OECE Parliamentary Assembly, which have different organizational cultures, but which have decided right from the beginning to start to work together to overcome the obstacles they faced. I will try to discuss the biggest challenges we're facing at the moment, which obviously Meg Russell and Lord Norton have already went into detail on some of the aspects that are the biggest problems, that this lack of informal space, the lack of the corridor talks. And in the end, I will try to shed some light on the future, which obviously isn't easy, but this is this is important to see how things will go in the future. So in the first place, what happened immediately in March and April, in the first months, most meetings were cancelled and or postponed. There was this initial feeling that things could last less time than actually they did in the end. And so a lot of events were postponed. And many were cancelled, but with the perspective that they could be carried on a bit later. The biggest challenge of the organizations was a two-faced challenge. On the one hand, they wanted to meet their core responsibilities, to continue their mandates, and they had to find out how they could do it. And on the other hand, they wanted to stay relevant at the same time. They wanted to help parliamentarians to provide them information through the exchange of good practice, to make them more prepared to deal, more informed and more prepared to execute their functions on the national parliaments. So a lot of international organizations found as the first way to react would be to cooperate at an international level. So a large number of international cooperation actions were carried out. I would like to highlight especially the meetings with WHO. Most of the parliamentarians belonging to these organizations had the opportunity to discuss directly with Dr. Tedros and with the high officials of WHO on how they could, how could parliamentarians be more involved in the process of combating COVID-19, and to get information, up-to-date and direct information on the crisis. As to this joint action, I would like to especially highlight that since the beginning, the three organizations that I mentioned started to work in collaboration, and the presidents of the three parliamentary assemblies issued a joint statement right at the beginning. And at the same time, at the staff level, the secretaries generals of the three organizations have maintained a close dialogue so as to the practical issues of managing these organizations while we were in crisis. So they discussed the technological adaptations, which were the best platforms to hold the meetings, with interpretation, how could they keep on doing some of the missions, in-presence missions, jointly. A lot of these efforts were conducted jointly by the three organizations. I've prepared a table of the major issues I thought that were involved in the response of these organizations to the crisis, and you'll see that obviously they have a different mandate, but more than that, they have different ways of acting. So Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe is much more bureaucratic organization, and they've tried to keep business as usual, even if remotely. And the other two organizations opted more for working on an informal way and finding alternative ways to keep their mandate. So in terms of the changes to the working procedures, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe will has mandated a member to study the possibilities, and they are holding a standing committee meeting later this month, where new rules of procedure will be adopted to face the possibility to have parliamentary assemblies hybridly or remotely. The thing to say is that, to my knowledge, no parliamentary organization, all of the parliamentary organizations resisted to conduct plenary assemblies remotely. It was felt that it would be impossible to manage such an event like that remotely. So even if a lot of decisions are pending, the meeting of the highest organ of each of these organizations, they have been reluctant to do so, and so they have opted to adopt the decisions that can be adopted in standing committees or in governing councils, like in the case of the Inter-parliamentary Union. But they are running away from holding plenary parliamentary assemblies at this time. The one exception is NATO Parliamentary Assembly, which will be holding its plenary session also later in November remotely. And we'll see how it goes, because it's the first time it will be done this way. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has opted to meet its standing committee in something it's called an enlarged standing committee, which means that all members, even those who usually don't have access to the standing committee, all members are invited to participate. They can participate, they can they can talk, they can speak, but they cannot vote. So the voting rights are reserved to members who really belong to the standing committee. Other than that, I would like to highlight also the fact that the only in-presence activities that took place in this period were the electoral observation missions. Many of the 14 electoral observation missions were cancelled. Some with far time in advance, others really later on, because there were no practical conditions to fly to the countries who were holding elections. Also, that the biggest problem that these organizations are facing is the parties. Well, how can parliamentarians manage their agendas when they're at their home countries, and they have to manage at the same time the meetings that they have to have at the parliament and at the national parliament, and the meetings that they have to have at the international organizations. When they travel to to Strasbourg or to Brussels for their meetings, they can be excused from their business as usual at the national level. And at this time, they're finding it's very hard to keep their agendas separated. And so, for instance, at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, there have been several quorum problems at committee meetings. Some committee meetings couldn't be held because they didn't have enough quorum. Some votes couldn't take place because although there was a quorum for attendance, there wasn't a quorum for the vote. This is something that will have to be worked on further ahead. I just wanted also to highlight the difference in the types of activities that have been carried away by each of these organizations. As I mentioned, the PACE has a more traditional approach, so they've kept to their to several committee meetings. The committees are meeting at the same same regularity, same periodicity as if they were meeting in presence. They are long meetings and with heavy agendas, and that's an option, obviously, from PACE. At the same time, the other two organizations have opted to reduce the number of statutory meetings, and have increased their informative webinars and means for exchange of information. NATO PA has held some webinars on the COVID situation, but mostly they have tried to stick to the reports and to the events on their traditional areas of interest. In contrast, OSCE PA has mainly focused on events related to COVID-19 and on its various facets, be it economic relief, the impact on minorities and on terrorism, on security, on women, but mostly focused on COVID-19. Finally, but certainly not least, the issue of elections for offices. this has been the big elephant in the room, because all of the organizations that had to conduct elections have postponed it as much as possible. Just recently in November, in the beginning of November, the Inter-parliamentary organization conducted the biggest tests for election in international organizations at the moment. They ran the election for the president of the organization, which has been a success. The election was open for 24 hours to allow for the different time, how do you say it? Well, time zones. And it was held electronically with the two-factor authentication. There was a plan B for delegations with problems, with internet connection problems. And they had 95% voter turnout, and it was a success really. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has been postponing its elections for judges for the Court of Human Rights and for the Office of Secretary General, but it will probably have this election in January. The Standing Committee will decide if this will take place by postal vote or by e-vote. I've heard that it's probably going to be by e-vote. NATO PA, on the other hand, has decided to face the risks of having a not so secure election, and they are going to hold their elections through the video conferencing platform they're using for their meetings. Normally, if there's only one candidate, that won't pose any problems, but we'll see how it goes, since we don't know if, at the moment, there's only one candidate for the most important office, which will, if that's the case in the end, it will make everything easier. The OSCE PA has decided that they will only have elections on when the next plenary takes place, so the offices will be prolonged. The offices will be prolonged for as long as possible, if necessary. So, in conclusion, I think my conclusions cannot be significantly different from the conclusions drawn by the previous presenters. Of course, the technological means have given us a lot of advantage and allowed us to keep these organizations relevant. Obviously, it's not the same thing. A lot of what goes on in these organizations happens through informal agreements, talks on the corridor. At the same time, these organizations will have to stop working on a provisional mode. They will have to find ways to rule for the near future. And so I think these meetings, these November meetings that are going to happen, will be very interesting in terms of what will come out in terms of the future. Thank you so much.